Not again, not again, not again.
Hello and welcome to the Exploding Appendix podcast. I'm Bradley Tuck, and in this episode I'll be talking to Ian Scott Horst about his fantastic book, Like Ho Chi Minh, Like Che Guevara, The Revolutionary Left in Ethiopia, 1969 to 1979. The session was recorded on the 1st of December 2020 as part of the Exploding Appendix Avant-Garde Art Practice and Research Group, which usually meets every fortnight to discuss something relating in some way to radical art, radical politics, avant-garde art and radical counterculture. The sessions are temporarily on hiatus, but should be starting back soon. So if you're interested in coming along, it's open to all and it's free. So if you're interested in coming along, just send me a message at explodingappendix@gmail.com. If you like this and you'd like to check out more of our work, please visit www.explodingappendix.com, and you can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, SoundCloud and Twitter. I think that's all I've got to say for now, so I'll hand over to Ian. So 2 weeks ago, we interviewed Gavin Walker about 1968 in Japan. And so in some ways, this session, although we're talking about a very different location, it sort of seems like a very similar period and sort of some similar kind of things that were going on at that time. So in what respects can we see revolutionary left in Ethiopia as part of sort of international struggles of that period? And also in what respects were these struggles unique to Ethiopia?
As near as I've been able to determine, Ethiopia in the 60s was an incredibly contradictory place. On the one hand, an autocrat who had a very tight control over his country and felt that he knew what was best. The Emperor Haile Selassie ran his country in a very paternalistic manner, but he also understood a need to develop his country, and he was a strong believer in Western education. And he essentially fostered what became a very large and influential student movement by both the development of higher education inside Ethiopia and using the education of Ethiopian students abroad as a kind of currency, both to make Ethiopia seem like a modern country in the eyes of the world and to actually, bring skills back to the country. And, that happened in the midst of a massive convulsion among young people in the 1960s and factors as diverse as local conditions to racism in the United States, to the war in Vietnam, towards other conflicts in other places, towards the Cultural Revolution in China, even the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia. All these things factored into a global student movement that was really, really had its finger on the pulse of the world and looked at all this revolution happening around them and really ran with it. And so it was in the middle of the Upsurge in 1968 that the first Ethiopian Socialist organization was formed, but it was formed in Europe by students, and that was the All Ethiopian Socialist movement. And it was formed, underground. It was, very, very clandestine, even to fellow students. And one of the things I point out in my book is that there are even, writers in the 70s who disputed the fact that the group even existed when it said it did, but it obviously did if you read the actual memoirs of participants and things. They found the brand of Marxist-Leninism that was spreading like wildfire around the world, largely through the student movement, really attractive, and approached it with a real enthusiasm for learning it and a real selflessness in terms of their identification of a historic task in need of people to undertake it. And they recognized that, according to Marxism, students didn't have the social power to carry out a revolution per se, but they also realized that they were the generation who was learning this stuff and put in a position of having, of wanting to attempt to, make this a reality in an Ethiopian context. Things happened very, very quickly. There was a huge international Ethiopian student movement. He used to have conferences and meetings all the time. These were not, debates over student life. They were, the internal debates of the student movement were over really serious questions of communist theory and how to relate to the political realities of Ethiopia and what they should be advocated. And as late as 1972 or 73, there were half the student movement was saying, well, we really need to be prepared because in 25 years there's likely to be a revolution in Ethiopia. And the other half was saying, you know what, something really big is happening in our country and we need to get settled much faster than that. And then as it turned out, the explosion happened in 1974. And although it's my opinion that, 10 years of student activism before that couldn't have helped but be a real informing factor on how that popular uprising unfolded, it was not actually led by the left. Although they talked a great deal about forming a revolutionary party, about underground organizing, they had detailed plans, and they were avid consumers of literature. And one of the things that was really interesting about the Ethiopian revolutionaries is that they, and I guess this probably comes from the depth to which they were embedded in the student movement. Although they were called Maoists or Marxist-Leninists, they actually were far less connected to one of the recognizable silos that we think of today. Like they were willing to read New Left economists in a way that Maoists and Marxist-Leninists would not have been willing to do. They were willing to read, Isaac Deutscher. They were willing to attempt to confront some of the criticisms of the Soviet Union in a way that was pretty groundbreaking and very much the social democratic international movement. It always had a criticism of the Soviet Union, but that was because it was, oppressive communism. So they managed to hollow out a point for a place in the movement for themselves where they were able to critique what was happening in the Soviet Union with nevertheless a strong commitment to, revolution and anti-imperialism. I think it's, in the United States, I think it's true in most European countries too, the 1960s created a whole new generation of left parties and a left ecosphere. And it was the era of the sectlet, with occasionally some party transcending a small size to be very influential. And that happened in the United States, I'd say almost a petty way. Like there were a lot of sects and a lot of parties, but none of them really made a serious impact on American society. But in this cauldron of the student movement of the 1960s, the small sectlets that the Ethiopian left created actually grew up so that all their tiny little arguments became massive real world issues of life and death. I know that there's a lot of all the anti-imperialist struggles of the 60s and 70s, they certainly, share a relationship to all the other things that were happening in the 1960s. But I feel like it's the Ethiopian student movement, unlike the American student movement or the French student movement, that actually came close to confronting power. And that's pretty amazing thing.
Yeah, because I was wanting to sort of ask, so elsewhere in the world, this is a big time for student movements. But unlike Europe and North America and elsewhere, in Ethiopia, there was no sort of democracy or freedom of the press or freedom of assembly. So how did this sort of shape the sort of student movement struggles in Ethiopia?
People in Ethiopia could not publish and freely distribute a radical leftist newspaper, but they could publish, until they got thrown into jail for doing so, almost anything they wanted to in their student journals. And so the Student Association at Haile Selassie University, all their college newsletters were, all about the Leninist path of building a party and how to be a professional revolutionary, and let's cheer on the National Liberation Front in South Vietnam. And they figured out how to operate in a repressive society in a sort of remarkable way. Now, the emperor realized what was happening, and he shut them down repeatedly, and tried various forms of repression. And most of the leadership of the Ethiopian left, spent, everywhere from a few months to a year to a couple of years to repeated stints in prison when they were in Ethiopia. They were constantly being locked up, and also constantly getting sprung. It was a real ongoing conflict there. But they made the most of the loopholes in the cracks in the repressive society that they could take advantage of. And when the repression got too much, there was a massive exodus in the early 70s of Ethiopian students. Going abroad was considered acceptable, so they weren't derided for doing so, but they spread out across the world. And there was this core group that I talk about in my book who actually hijacked a plane and wound up in Algeria, and they set up the second and what became probably the largest Ethiopian left group, which was eventually called the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Party, or EPRP, wasn't called that at first. They used their base in Algeria and their bases in the associations of Ethiopian students in Europe, the Middle East, and North America to actually do organizing work for the revolution, basically. Some of the students from the late 60s kind of peeled off and did what students do and became academics, and some of them settled into professorships in North America and all of that. But most of them, their aspiration was to go home and be a professional revolutionary.
So in your book, you discuss a number of influences on the Ethiopian left from that period, such as Che Guevara, Ho Chi Minh, Lenin, Mao, and even sort of groups like, the Black Panthers. Globally speaking, there was a kind of tension at the time between old and new forms of the left. So how did these different lefts come together within the Ethiopian context?
Somewhat interestingly, because there was such complete repression, there were, in European countries, Asian countries, American countries, there's always been this evolution of a social democratic left and a hard communist left, often associated with the Soviet Union or China. Because, I don't know if it's specifically because of the repression in Ethiopia or the fact that there were no parties or no publications. There were not these traditional silos of left influence inside the country. There was a trade union movement that had been pretty explicitly started by the CIA to promote labor peace in Ethiopia as Ethiopia was beginning the industrialization. And that labor union was wildly and widely derided as being, a captive creature of the Ethiopian bourgeoisie and, American imperialism. Like, people didn't take it seriously. But somehow, in 1974, all of that really changed. And the one thing that it did not happen until honestly, this year was the creation in Ethiopia of a solid bourgeois liberal Republican politic. So in the year of the uprising in 1974, the choices became the radicals doing their agitation, the royalists preparing to resist that agitation, and the military, who was keenly attentive to the issue of power. But there were politicians who had social democratic leanings, but there was nobody saying, "Hey, let's set up a society just like the United States," or the ideology of African socialism that swept the continent to Ethiopia's neighbors like Tanzania. Like, the one thing that Haile Selassie's alliance with the Western world really did was prevent that kind of softer, more indigenous social democratic movement from ever developing. in Ethiopia. And so the liberals in 1974 kind of just got, to the extent that they existed, kind of just got locked out of the whole process. And really, so that's just was not an issue. When the military regime seized power in 1974, they called their form of government Ethiopian socialism, which came as a surprise to the world, because although the world had been aware that there were radicals agitating, they didn't really realize that the military was going in that direction. And of course, the United States and everybody else assumed that this Ethiopian socialism meant that they were, being manipulated by the Soviet Union or China. And actually, neither of those things were true yet. The ultimate pro-Soviet kind of hardline Soviet-style, quote-unquote, socialism that the military influenced, they were actually first taught by leftists. When the Soviet Union were the people who was going to give the government aid, that's when the military kind of embraced this Soviet-style, in my opinion, revisionist form of Marxist-Leninism, with all the trappings of Russian posters and North Korean statues. But that was really a long time in coming. That was not, it was not the Russians doing the agitating in 1974. Does that answer your question? I think that back to that.
I think the question was about the different influences of the left coming together. It comes together differently within the military as it does with the radical groups. There
were people in Ethiopia who call themselves Maoists. Doesn't necessarily mean exactly what Maoism means today, as it's a whole other subject. This Maoists today have an endless debate over what they call Mao Zedong thought versus Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, being actually like almost a break from mere Marxism, Leninism. It's not super clear that anything like that was really being embraced by the Ethiopian student movement, but because China was engaged in this kind of global war of propaganda with imperialism in the West, all the super revolutionary ideas, that China seemed more connected to those than Russia, which was preaching, peaceful coexistence. And, although the Cold War was, still a real thing, the outward face of the Russians was, let's build peace and harmony and international affairs and not rock the boat. And then, a lot of countries, the Russian-supported communist parties wound up being, very, very reactionary because they wanted to preserve kind of a liberal spot in society. The currency of the Ethiopian radical movement was the kind of radicalism that was that gave birth to the new communist movement in the United States, which was what the Maoists called themselves. I think Trotskyism was more hegemonic in Europe than Maoism. But even there, the EPRP actually had a relationship with a number of, I didn't actually really put this in my book, but they had a relationship with a number of Trotskyist groups, like the German Trotskyists wound up helping them get space for conferences at universities and things like that. So they were willing to break out of the boxes that they were forced in. Now, eventually, when the Ethiopian divided into pro and anti-military factions, the more radical faction, the EPRP, was always accused of being anarchists or Maoists or Trotskyites or anything but actual revolutionaries. The veterans of that era who I've talked to reject all of those labels for themselves, but they were definitely living in a world where everybody read Mao. They had an amazing document. It was called the Handbook of Revolutionary Struggle, and there was like a red book-sized pamphlet that had, in addition to discussions of politics, had instructions on how to build a clandestine movement and all this sort of stuff.
It was written by students, wasn't it?
It was. Actually, I had been befriended in all of this by a man named Yasu Alamayehu, who was one of the leaders of the EPRP. He was one of the people on that hijacking flight in 1969 that started the Algerian base. And he actually told me a story after I wrote the book that they put this thing together from their notes after reading Mao and reading, there's a Comintern, a revolutionary struggle book. I think they also read like Carlos Marghela's, all these sort of manuals for how to do revolution. They stitched it all together. They did all this in Algeria and they sent it to the United States. And it's like, this is going to be our secret organizing manual. And the Ethiopian Students Union in North America wound up putting it out as a pamphlet, which kind of horrified them back home because they were like, we realized this, like you've just printed all our secret plans. But nevertheless, it wound up being a really influential pamphlet that people described seeing and using in Ethiopia years later. It was kind of like the Bible of their movement. And that was heavily, heavily filled with, Maoist axioms and stuff from General Zap in Vietnam.
So I was cooking right at the beginning, so apologies if this has already been answered a little bit, but I suppose I had two sort of very like preliminary questions, I suppose, about just what particularly, so who in particular the student movement was targeting their resources at, because it's a very different situation. In America, you can say that the student movement had certain goals and certain differences with the way the government and American imperialism was working, but it seems like something very different in Ethiopia, in that the student movement is fighting various bodies that are supported by either, two massive sort of imperial forces, the Soviet Union and America. So where were they directing their attention? And then my second question, I don't know if I'm kind of jumping the gun, because I suppose that's big enough, but it was kind of, because I'm so ignorant about Ethiopia just in general, what happened after the period. So in terms of its sort of political history, could you really briefly sketch sort of after the 68 movement, what happened then, just so I can get a better...
Sure. Well, there was a revolutionary upsurge in 1974 that went on for some months, that the military had actually participated in an uprising in the beginning, and wound up, it was the military who actually deposed the emperor in the fall of 74. And up until that time, the student movement had agitated against the imperial government for being, corrupt, and for, there was like a massive famine in Ethiopia in the early 70s that basically the emperor just said, I don't want to hear about this. So he tried to cover it up. And when the BBC did a whole special on the famine, and the revolutionaries caused this to be shown on Ethiopian television, and it was a huge, shocking thing. They agitated at great length against United States and Israeli aid and involvement with their economy and social movements. They had protests against the Peace Corps, for instance, and all that. What changed after 1974 was that the military was trying to find its footing, and under the influence of the left began to institute very serious reforms, but was still being aided by the United States. Like, they still had treaties and military arrangement with the United States. So they were looking, they sent people to, to Russia, to North Korea, to China, to try and get aid. And the Mengistu, who became the head of state after 1977, when he basically arranged for Soviet sponsorship for his government, and arranged for, he basically said, I'm gonna overthrow the other people in my government, and you're going to support me, Soviet Union, and we're going to do great things together. And so that's basically what happened. And that happened in 1977. He had a lot of other people in his government killed, and then proceeded to attempt to smash the civilian left, which took a couple of years, but he successfully did. And then Mengistu eventually set up the Workers' Party of Ethiopia on the model of any number of workers and socialist parties that ran countries in Eastern Europe, that are no longer socialist today. Very, very much along the way Soviet client states were organized. He attempted to institutionalize his politics through the period of the 1980s, but it was kind of a losing battle against. Although the EPRP, although the civilian left was defeated, national liberation fronts were not defeated, and both the Eritreans and the Tigray People's Liberation Front, which is in the news today, were the forces that ultimately dislodged Mengistu in 1991. He tried briefly turning Ethiopia into like a non-aligned economy, and he tried saying, well, we're not a Soviet client state anymore, but it didn't really work. And so the TPLF kicked him out and seized power in 1991, and they were actually, the core of the TPLF was a hardcore Marxist-Leninist sect who were actually Hojites. They actually looked to socialist Albania, but they, it's in the ways of that tradition. When they seized power, it was kind of the last time they ever talked about socialism was the day before they seized power. So the TPLF seized power in 1991, and one of the issues that had always haunted the left in Ethiopia, because this is the major issue in Ethiopia as we see today, is the issue of the multinational nature of Ethiopia and what to do about all its restive national minorities. And actually the dominant ethnicity at the time was actually a minority, which is the Amharic people were actually a minority in Ethiopia, and the Oromo people were a numerical majority, and that's still true today. But they attempted in the early 90s, and my book really only scrapes the surface of this, but they attempted to set up a very bureaucratic capitalism, very state heavy, but they undertook massive development and were very successful at it. But they also created this federal system in Ethiopia that was theoretically supposed to provide equality to all the different nationalities in Ethiopia, but kind of did the reverse, and it turned everybody resentful against the Tigrayan people, who were a minority in the north of the country, and although the investors in Ethiopia from China, United States, and Europe were very, very happy with Ethiopian governments in the past 25 years, the Ethiopian people have not been so happy about them, in that so what we see happening now is, finally this very pro-Western government, or these pro-Western forces have seized the government and are finally undoing, the last legacies of the 1970s by defeating the TPLF. I don't know what it means for Ethiopia coming up. I mean, the TPLF, I have no way of knowing if they still consider themselves Marxists of some kind, but they didn't do anything in power that was remotely geared towards popular power in any way. Like they did have a wave of elections, but then they proceeded to cancel all the following elections. It's almost like it's this year that is the new chapter. Like everything in my book is kind of like the last legacies of it are finally now done. The EPRP still exists, mostly in exile, and they've actually tried to take advantage of this moment to talk about democracy in a way that very few people in Ethiopia have talked about. But the ethnic issues are very difficult ones.
Actually, one of the things I did actually want to ask a bit about was that it was often thought at the time as being, from the student movement's perspective, being the Black Vietnam. So I wondered how much sort of Vietnam itself...
I was a child in the 60s, and the Vietnam War was like the thing we thought about all the time. My father had occasionally called himself an anarchist, but was mostly a good liberal. But they were really opposed to the war. That informed their politics, all the time. And that's mainstream bourgeois liberals were like that. So in countries where imperialism and it was actually oppressing them, and where armed struggle seemed like a viable strategy, they absolutely identified what they were doing as part of this global war against imperialism that was waging in Vietnam. And it made them, they were very, very conscious of the turn in the American civil rights movement from, peaceful to militant protests. They were keenly aware of the Black Power movement. They read Kwame Ture. They were really, the pressures that created the radical wing of the Black liberation movement in the United States were keenly felt and observed by the Ethiopian movement. So they really felt like they wanted to identify with this global movement. One of the chief ironies of this whole struggle is that before 1974, they considered their main enemy or oppressor in the world to be United States imperialism, and that's who they expected to be fighting. And with the turn of events in Ethiopia, the war between the Eritrean National Liberation Movement, which I don't really go into at great length in my book, but that was a war that started in 1961 between the Eritrean nationalists and the empire, and that became a hotter war in the early 70s. And then when the military took power, they just continued that same war. So here you have like allegedly socially progressive force maintaining, this fairly vicious war against a restive national minority. And the Ethiopian students realized what a force imperialism was, and and how armed struggle needed to be a part of their arsenal for dealing with it. They found that movement just tremendously inspiring. The title of my book comes from a song that they used to sing at the drop of a hat, apparently, that basically, it was an adaptation of an Ethiopian folk song about the resistance to Italian invasions that was kind of rewritten for being inspired by Ho Chi Minh and Che Guevara. That they thought those people were just terrific, because they're actually fighting U.S. imperialism, like out there in the forests and the jungles, and so they felt like they were going to join that fight. And then what happened, of course, was they joined that fight, and they suddenly found themselves arrayed against Cuba and the Soviet Union, which was they would never have guessed that. But by the mid 70s, it was so topsy turvy, and it was very difficult for the left at the time to grasp that. And I think it's hard for people to understand now, like how could this allegedly progressive socialist countries locked in combat with imperialism called the Cold War could wind up being a repressive agency against people fighting for social justice and people's democracy, and just so topsy-turvy. That's a really hard, painful lesson, and it turns out that people lie. I don't know if anybody's familiar with that, but people lie. So sometimes when they say one thing, that's not actually what they mean, and the story of the Ethiopian Revolution is trying to uncover the truth underneath all of the posture and posing. Many leftists today who are wax enthusiastic about socialist Ethiopia and what a wonderful communist hero Mengistu was, and how he was an opponent of the United States imperialism, and how tragic it was that he was overthrown. And it's certainly true that United States imperialism was very glad to see him gone, but it doesn't make him a legitimate anti-imperialist or cover up for the truth of what actually happened in Ethiopia in the mid-70s, which was the downside of my book, is this horrible story of repression.
I had
three questions. They're all kind of big questions though. So I don't know if it'd be okay to just say them all out
Go for it.
now, or should one at a time, or wait, or?
Oh, look, go for it. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. I appreciate it. My first question was about whether there was any kind of process like in other countries where students either industrialized or went to the land to either become, organizing with workers directly or with farmers and peasants in Ethiopia, and if there was any kind of strategic effort in that regard. And the second one was about the EPRP's relationship to the National Liberation Fronts that you mentioned, and whether there was, just what that relationship was, and if there was a kind of Ethiopian chauvinism or maybe an Amharic chauvinism. And the last one was kind of what you ended your last thing on, which was what the Soviet and Cuban intervention meant politically and how that changed the different movements' politics.
Great questions. I think that there were some individual cases before 1974 of the left trying to embed themselves where the people were. Actually, one of the leftists who I think played a very negative role, he lost a factional. His name was Sene Like, and he lost a factional battle in the international Ethiopian student movement in the early 70s. But he decided to go back to Ethiopia, where he consciously started giving karate lessons to karate and military lessons to people in the army, like to rank and file soldiers. Like that was he was a strong believer in the armed struggle, and so he thought that the way to get to the armed struggle was to work with people who knew how to do armed struggle in the army. And that was actually the initial inroad of the left towards the military. It was done by him. In 1974, yes, the EPRP made a concerted effort to embed themselves in certain industries and organizations. One of the things most especially was the Ethiopian labor movement. This Confederation of Ethiopian Labor Unions that has been set up by the CIA. They basically took over and kicked the CIA out. It had, before that, during the Revolutionary Year in '74, the Confederation led a general strike. So it completely shocked everybody and renovated, public opinion of what side they were on by doing that. Is the IEPRP realized that they needed to be with that. So I don't know. Class is a very complicated issue in Ethiopia. To be honest, the radical movement, these were children of privilege. I mean, there were occasional poor people who would get a scholarship to go to college, and some of those people, joined the revolutionary movement. But a lot of the people in the student movement were the children of aristocrats and people in government. And so, like, several EPRP bigwigs were lawyers, and so they joined the Labor Confederation as functionaries of that. I don't know to what extent, I'm sure they had a rank and file orientation, but I don't know how that unfolded initially when the military regime decided to crush the Labor Confederation and replace it with a docile pro-state group. They formed their own revolutionary labor union. I'm not sure what kind of support it got, quite honestly. By the time the repression had begun, they were, it's the old line about, no battle plan survives first contact with the enemy. So like all of the things that actually wound up happening in Ethiopia kind of confounded their plans. They had a plan that they started before the uprisings, I believe, of establishing a rural base area where they were going to build support among peasants and build, the kind of base area that I suppose Mao and the Chinese communists pictured of, working with local peasantry on, issues that were important to them, as well as providing almost like a dual power, like a place for those people to, practice, building their own state. Things happened so quickly that they really did not get very far in their rural efforts before they were really forced to defend themselves militarily. So I think that they had a much more elaborate intention of embedding themselves with the peasant population than they actually achieved. One of the really interesting things that happened was this thing called the Zametcha. In the end of the revolutionary year, the government came up with this plan to send thousands and thousands of students to the countryside. And they said it was to evangelize the revolution, but it's pretty clear that they were concerned about the potential of radical students running around Ethiopia's cities while there was so much ferment. So, they put all these teenagers in uniforms and sent them off to the country, and they told them to teach the peasants socialism. And at first, the left was kind of like, well, I don't really want to, go on a government campaign. But then they realized this was a huge opportunity. So basically the left kind of took this Zametcha over. Like they used it as their own recruiting vehicle. And so it was embedding in this popular, I wouldn't call it a movement because it was created by the government, but this phenomenon of, student cadres going off to preach socialism to the peasants, they basically took over that process. And the government was very angry at that. That really backfired on the government. Eventually the military government, acting on the advice of the socialist movement, the Mason group, set up political education among workers to support the government. I don't know to what extent the EPRP was able to do that for its part, since very quickly the EPRP was, considered toxic and targeted by the government, so not tolerated by them. So I'm not really sure exactly how that happened. On your second question, the National Front is a very complicated question, and I actually find everything I've learned about the history of Ethiopia, both from this period and what's happening today, to be a real challenge to a lot of the orthodoxies around the national question. It's very clear in the 60s that the Amharic people were the this dominant nationality in Ethiopia, and laid down the law for the other nationalities. Ethiopia had absorbed Eritrea after the Second World War, but as much as there is a cultural similarity between Eritrea and Ethiopia, 50 years of Italian occupation had turned the Eritrean people into very different society. They had many labor unions, they had political parties in Eritrea. There was all sorts of stuff there that didn't exist in the rest of the country. It was said that Eritreans were kind of the core of the civil service for the whole country because of their experience in Italian occupation. The first challenge of the left to the empire was calling out the emperor for oppressing national minorities, and that was hugely controversial. It was a main site of controversy on the left for that whole period. And the relationship between the Ethiopian identified left and the national minority identified left was very, very, very combative throughout the 70s. The Eritrean People's Liberation Front and EPRP attempted many times to conduct joint work or issue solidarity statements, and they did to a certain degree, but they were very, very shallow, and they identified more conflicts than other. The national liberation struggle in Tigray, even though there were a lot of Tigrayans in the EPRP, became a real source of conflict with the EPRP, and that was actually the main active threat to their organizing peasant base areas was from these other leftists of the TPLF who gained some hegemony among the peasant population of Tigray that they did not. So they didn't do a great job. They initially understood that an Amharic-centered group needed to pay at least lip service to national liberation and to the oppression of national minorities. But when it came down to it, their commitments were shallow. Their first program omitted a recognition of Eritrean independence. They generated some bad blood, and by the time of the country entered what you'd say a real civil war in the 1980s, I think that the left was really pretty unsympathetic to the idea of national liberation and saw that it's like a competing strategy for the country. And today, I have a lot of questions about whether the Amhara people can still be considered, the oppressor nationality in Ethiopia. To what extent political secession, autonomy, to what extent these are solutions under capitalism that don't actually solve what they're designed to solve and create tremendous, the fruit of, I'll use the phrase of identity politics in Ethiopia for the past 25 years has really been massive bad blood between nationalities. And, my political Ethiopian friends who are Amhara are completely freaked out about the Muslim Oromos and this guy named Jawar Muhammad, who's a sort of semi-oppositional figure, and he was expected to win the elections that Abiy Ahmed postponed. They're very, very, the TPLF actively repressed the EPRP, so they're very, very bitter against them. So I don't, unfortunately, see good news in Ethiopia in the near future about, national questions. I don't. As a good leftist, I want to be, sympathetic to, oppressed populations. Like the Oromos certainly, deserve their own voice and their right of self-determination. But at the same point, I can really see that the thing called Ethiopia is kind of on the line right now. Like, does that survive the international machinations which are still going on and the ethnic conflicts inside the country? And I don't know. As a communist, I guess I'm not sure what my bottom line is, whether to what extent I think like revolutionaries should be attached to the notion of, Ethiopia, which there's many reasons for Ethiopians to be proud of this entity that, survived colonialism in a way that other countries didn't, but I don't know. Your last question was about the Soviet Union and Cuba. Did you have a specific angle on that? I can't actually read my last name right now. Could you? I
guess it's sort of like how that impacted the left in Ethiopia and the national liberation struggles, I guess.
My friend Iyasu remembers being in Algeria and petitioning the Cuban government for assistance, trying to get like Cuban passports for them, and really not being taken seriously. They completely dismissed them. They were not interested in them. And I'm not really sure why that's true, because you would think that before 1974, the Eritrean struggle would certainly have been something that Cuba and the OSPAL, the Tricontinental, would have been interested in supporting, but they only paid a certain amount of lip service to it. And I don't know if then, by the time that Cuba and the Soviet Union got really involved in internal Ethiopian politics, they were on the side of a military which was, waging war against national liberation struggles. I mean, the government said that they supported the right of Eritrean people to peaceful self-determination, but they considered the independence movement to be an agent of Arab nationalist reaction. The story of the military regime, its entire existence was at war with the Eritreans. The EPRP, there's a Congress of the Soviet Union in the mid-70s, the Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, that the EPRP sent greetings to. Like, they were attempting to be, as a fledgling international movement in need of support, they attempted to reach out for support but they got, there's, issues of Pravda denouncing them as, anarchists and Trotskyites and agents of the CIA. So that was really very one-sided. Once the military regime, embraced Soviet, quote unquote, Marxism-Leninism, there was really no turning back for, Russian policy towards Ethiopia or the Ethiopian revolutionaries. Like they were on the side of the government. The Cubans had some qualms. They fostered what's basically a lie that the Cubans were, there's massive Cuban military assistance to Ethiopia following the Somali invasion of Ethiopia in 1977. And the Soviet Union and the Ethiopian government and Cuba all said that, the Somali invasion was the attempt of U.S. imperialism to overthrow the Ethiopian revolution. To be quite honest, I think that that's bullshit. I think that the Somali invasion of Ethiopia was the agenda of the Somali government to reunite Somalia. And global politics certainly got in the way of all of that. The Somalis lost their Soviet sponsorship and solicited American sponsorship. But actually, the Americans never really washed their hands of the Ethiopian government. There's a lot of realpolitik going around, all the relationships in that region. And so the Cuban lie was that the Cuban military would not participate in the war against the Eritrean movement, that they would not. And it is true that they did not send troops to fight on the Eritrean front, but they absolutely armed the Ethiopian army to death. And if the Cuban army was facing the Somali army in the desert, the Ethiopian army was pushing back the Eritrean offensive. So it was really, and there are, secret memos from Castro saying, well, I'm really sympathetic to the Eritrean cause, but, this is the force of imperialist reaction and Arab nationalism. And he was actually fully in support of crushing the Eritrean struggle, which is really contrary to the mythology of Cuba's international. The Ethiopian left that supported the military regime, actually, it's more complicated than that, but they were horrified at the Soviet intervention into, once Mengistu signed a treaty with the Russians, there were like Russian advisors everywhere, Russians and East Germans and North Koreans, all that stuff, doing all sorts of stuff in the economy. They thought that this was, they're like Ethiopian nationalism came out, and so they broke with the military regime in part because of their involvement with the Soviet Union. The Cubans tried unsuccessfully to heal the breach between the socialist movement and the government, but that didn't really work because Mengistu was pretty clear he didn't want any threat of opposition. So they're kind of like, well, you want to kill them all, you're just going to, I guess you want to turn our eyes while you do that. I mean, neither the Russians nor the Cubans celebrated the repression exactly. I mean, they advocated for the suppression of the parties, but the body count was embarrassing to them.
I wonder maybe if we would just go back to 1974 for a little bit then. I'm sort of wondering about the sort of strikes and the agitations that emerged in 1974, because we could look at, the fact that the military kind of comes to power and doesn't institute a kind of particularly democratic model. How much was the actual agitations and struggles that were going on at the time, how much were they kind of embodying ideas of sort of democratic socialism and some of the other student movements that had kind of gone before?
What gave the left traction in 1974 was this call for democracy. They raised the slogan for a people's provisional government, and so a government that was created by the people, and it sounds like such a cliche, but and that would be responsible to the people rather than whatever the military had in mind. I mean, the military attempted various institutions to assist it in running the country. But it was pretty clear the military ran the country. Like it didn't, you know, it's not like until the late 80s, you know, the leadership of the country, they all, you know, wore military uniforms, you know, like it was clearly a military regime. So, but the idea of a popular democratic government was wildly popular and seemed to be like really instantly understood by everybody in the country. You know, you hear people who have gone through revolutions, like they talk about this, you know, sudden awakening of popular opinion and, you know, people caring about things that, you know, they never cared about before, and, you know, excitement and popular participation. And so that the idea of a popular democracy was received really well by people. Like, I think it was the most Maoist thing of the EPRP to do was to kind of figure out raising what banner that for the people, what they really wanted. And it turns out people really wanted to be involved in how they ran the country, and that the military only offered the illusion of that. And I think at first the EPRP was a little bit shy about using the word socialism. Like, I think that the military government used the word socialism before the EPRP, which is kind of interesting. But once socialism became the currency of popular discussion, the EPRP really ran with it. And, you know, I quoted, you know, a very large portion of my book is, you know, the excerpts of original documents for those of you who haven't seen it. And, you know, they explained what they meant by democracy quite clearly. And they really contrasted it to, you know, both Western democracy and to undemocratic socialism, like in the Soviet Union. Like they were really clear that socialism is what Ethiopia needed, and the way to be socialist was, you know, not to do what the military was doing, but to actually, you know, give people the power to decide their future. And it was, I think it's one of the few places where that was actually the angle of revolutionaries in the 70s. Like, I think if you look at other revolutionary movements, you know, from that time, like especially like guerrilla movements, and either successful ones in Southeast Asia, ones or unsuccessful ones in Southeast Asia, or you know, in India that got started around the same time, or in Latin America. Like, I don't really think that they had this broad ideological notion of people's power, but they didn't talk about it in such specific democratic, you know, let's make sure the masses are really running society ways that the Ethiopians talked about it. I have read, you know, their literature all my life since I was first interested in this, but going back over it, I thought that their understanding of what communism is potentially about was so much deeper and more profound than what passes for, you know, understandings of communism and socialism now in you know, most of the world, the left today. Like, you know, they really meant putting the masses of people in power under the, you know, with the leadership and leverage of the proletariat and a guerrilla army. And it was very logically argued in a kind of integrated way about how all this stuff was connected. And that's, you know, not something like, if you look at other leftist propaganda from the period, you know, there's a lot of talk about imperialism and the just struggle of the people, this and people that, but not so much like, what's the vehicle for this going to look like? And so I think that they were pretty impressive. And to their credit, in a very undemocratic country, they're still raising popular democracy as a solution to the problems in Ethiopia today. I mean, I sort of, you know, whether the EPRP is still a left group is eminently debatable, but you know, that fundamental idea that justice is going to come from the people themselves seizing control and reorganizing things in a mass democratic way was very explicitly and openly stated in a way that it's just not, you don't hear on the rest of the left. And it was not like namby-pamby. This is not like, soft socialism. This is not like calling it democratic socialism to seem less scary. This is calling socialism democratic because they really wanted socialism that was democratic.
Was that partly because of the context in which they were working and where it wasn't really a democracy at all?
Yeah, so, to be honest, I'm not actually sure. I think that I'm not sure where it all comes from in terms of if there's a specific Ethiopian cultural context for that. One of the things that I sort of it's a minor point, but I find kind of fascinating. But in a left world renowned for throwing up people who call themselves the great leader and demand virtual worship, the political leadership of the EPRP was very selfless. They used pseudonyms for everything. I know that there are people with controlling and undemocratic impulses in that leadership, but I also know that there's something about the way that their movement grew up that made their politics and their practice, or their praxis, I guess that's what we talk about when we say praxis, a very healthy and legitimate product of moral values and strategy and all that stuff. They didn't build personality cults around their leadership at all.
No, reading about them was really, really interesting, actually. I think that was one of the something that was really special about the book, because you have so many quotes. I actually think that really gives you an insight into how they were thinking. I guess in contrast, the military sort of seizes control, and as you sort of argue in the book, how they derail the revolution. So the Derg, due to the way they present themselves, seem sort of ideologically hard to place. But there was one sort of description that you kind of...
And the Derg are the military, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's one kind of description that you kind of give in your book of Mengistu as far from being the Ethiopian revolution's Lenin, was instead the triumphant Kornilov. So I just thought that was a really interesting kind of take, and I partly just wanted you to actually kind of expand on that, really, or just to talk about it. But maybe I suppose I was wondering how the sort of placing these kind of other revolutionary stories over the top help us understand the symbolic confusion that goes on within the...
Right. The Derg, the EPRP, the Ethiopian Socialist movement, to some extent the National Liberation Movements, the Somali government, these people all, loved red flags and hammers and sickles and pictures of Lenin and all this sort of stuff. They expressed themselves they were sharing a language that had, just become hegemonic in the politics of the region. As near as I can tell, Mengistu was really, really attracted to the way that Soviet-style politicians and client parties and states worked. He thought, he got it. He loved their methods for social control. He liked the rhetoric. He liked this heroic posture. He overthrew an empire. So, it's not like everything he was about was personal gain and, unspeakable evil and killing people. He put his money where his mouth was in the time. But I mentioned this here briefly before, but, it's really hard to be able to look at someone who says one thing and realize that they mean something entirely different by it, even though you could say the same thing that, we all go around this room and all say that we're all socialists, assuming we all were, but that doesn't necessarily mean we all actually have the same set of politics. And Mengistu became very skilled at the mythology and wordplay of Marxism-Leninism. And I don't know the man personally, but he seemed really like when the North Koreans finally took him seriously enough to come and set up statues all over the country. Like, I think he felt like, wow, this is I've really like made this. This is like really the thing. But I think it's really important to look at the reality of social forces and classes, class interests, class program, who's actually benefiting from things. And so there's this mythology about the Ethiopian revolution that Mengistu really developed. He developed this theory of the man in uniform that was basically all about how, because of Haile Selassie's repression, the only class in Ethiopian society that had the ability to organize itself and affect change was the military. And that military is going around waving red flags and pictures of Lenin. So, of course, like, Cuba and the Soviet Union and the left are like, yeah, these are socialists just like everybody else. But if you actually really look at the dynamics of the revolution and the specific role played, like you take away everything Mengistu says, you take away all of the propaganda, you get a much different picture. And although he used even legitimate social reforms as a kind of propaganda for his own power, the bottom line was always his own power. And he chose a route, sort of a combination of repression. And in the West, I don't know about, most of you are a lot younger than I. We grew up learning about communism as though, there was never sunshine in the Soviet Union or China. It was always cloudy day. People were always miserable. They would go home and cry themselves to sleep, wishing that they had blue jeans. And the Soviet Union and China is nothing but misery for everybody involved. Now, that's really not true. Even if you have a harsh critique of Soviet or Chinese versions of socialism, a lot of Chinese and Soviet citizens really loved their governments because of, for the same reason that, Americans love their horrible governments and British people love their horrible governments. And so we often want to believe, what we're told about the way the world works. So, this myth of Mengistu as Ethiopian Lenin is kind of like, well, here's this junior officer comes out of nowhere, pulls focus out of an amorphous popular uprising, turns it into a revolution, gets rid of an empire, yeah, sure, that's exactly what Lenin did, right? But, of course, it's not really. And that gets at the degeneration of socialist thought, in the past 100 years, like to be quite honest with you, I'm a little cagey about my personal leftist silo. I'm often called a Maoist, which is not exactly true, but it's not exactly untrue either. But we sort of choose, the left chooses some degree of mythology or factual understanding about the way socialism unfolded and its successes and failures in the 20th century. And if you're the kind of person who really wants to defend every Marxist-Leninist regime, no matter how many horrible things it did in say in the 1970s, then you can make quite a case for that from the writings or the publications of the Ethiopian government. Like, they say that they're building new democracy and working towards socialism and democratizing society and all that stuff, but they weren't really doing any of that. Like, what Mengistu was actually doing was consolidating his personal power and using people's aspirations for a better world as a kind of leverage to do that. And he gave people some of what they wanted, as all rulers do. No ruler runs by, sheer terror all the time. But the notion of Mengistu as historically progressive revolutionary. It's very shallow, it comes from Mengistu's imagination and from a bunch of leftists who have really lost their way in being able to define what socialism is supposed to be. So by my analysis of the Russian Revolution, which has a lot of kind of uncanny parallels to the Ethiopian Revolution, right down to, a revolution in the middle of winter, and then a second revolution the same year in the fall, to the contention of forces and that whole process of the year. The Kornilov, he was pro-Tsar in a way that Mengistu is not pro-Haile Selassie. But, he was an opportunist who saw his moment to attempt to seize power from weak politicians who had not entirely broken with the Tsar, with Tsarism, and by way of forestalling the Bolsheviks. And so Mengistu was kind of in the same position. Like, he looked at the stuff on the street, and he didn't want Haile Selassie back in power. He wanted to be Haile Selassie. So he used the language of the period and the arguments of the period, but in a way to give himself power and to forestall the Ethiopian Bolsheviks, and to make sure that he was presiding over the refashioning of the Ethiopian state, which gradually happened over the course of the mid-70s. I think, to accept my analogy about Kornilov, it's less about the specific politics of Kornilov and more about a definition of what socialism isn't. Because, you could make a checklist of the terrible things that Mengistu did, and you say, well, the Bolsheviks had a red terror. The Bolsheviks killed civilians. The Bolsheviks fought wars. This, that, and the other revolutionary movement did this, that, or the other horrible thing also. And you think, well, it's just this matter of degrees. But it's not the matter of degrees. It's actually completely different. Like they attempted to graft a linguistical niceties over the reality of what was happening. So, you can call what the Bolsheviks did after the Bolshevik Revolution red terror, and you can call what Mengistu did after the Ethiopian Revolution red terror. But if you actually look at what those two things were, and I don't think any kind of terror should be the particular goal of revolutionaries, but in terms of the defense of a new revolutionary society, that's not what Mengistu was doing. A case could be made for that's what Lenin was doing. Now, I understand that anarchists and left comms and other traditions of the left movement can have a debate over the health of early Soviet society, but he used the word red terror to make it seem like he was just doing what the Bolsheviks did, whereas actually he was doing something really horrifying, which was killing hundreds of thousands of young communists, who were actually advocating socialism when he was not, who were actually advocating for good things when he's not, which is a little different than the main focus of the Bolsheviks' repression, which was people who wanted to undo the revolution, and so it's very easy to accept the words that political people use. And I think it's really important to step back and make sure we're in agreement in our definitions.
I think this is quite relevant to something that I've been thinking about a little bit recently. So in the last session that we did a couple of weeks ago on the Japanese 68 student movement, Gavin spoke a little bit about the Japanese author Mishima debating students, because he was a big imperialist, supported the emperor, and thought that it had weakened, and then eventually killed himself, committed ritual suicide or whatever. But he had a really effective, Gavin was saying, that, and I've sort of read up on it a little bit afterwards, that he had a really effective debate against students that were claiming themselves to be Marxists at the time, because he was saying, I understand, burn everything, create this revolutionary fervor or whatever, but there's one thing that you've forgotten. You don't support the emperor, which seems like a really dogmatic thing to say, right? But I think what was implied in it is that there was something about Japanese culture which couldn't quite capture just simply a Marxist critique of it. So when I think of, like, if you're trying to think of socialism and how it's going to, you know, so what is it particularly about the Marxist canon which operates in a different way? Because, you know, there's some similarity in the utopian aspects of it, even to someone like John Rawls. But my critique of John Rawls is probably useless to apply to, you know, like a modern world. So I suppose it, like, in the terms of the Ethiopian revolution, how far, like, were the students that were, or the people that were mostly involved, like the general members of the EPRP, how much Marx would they have read, or like how much of it, you know, so how much of the sort of like spirit of capital, because the situation is very different in Ethiopia because of tribal systems or whatever. Did any of that negatively impact upon the revolution because there was a mindset to approach things in a Marxist way instead of just this sort of more utopian?
Well, I think that we have to distinguish between the student movement before 1974 and then, you know, the population of revolutionary Ethiopia from 74 on.
Yeah.
I think that the student movement was very, very literate in its understanding of Marxist ideas and Marxist, you know, and historical issues and history, and very, very oriented in that. It's somewhat disconnected from this. I just saw a fascinating clip of a TPLF guerrilla in the late 80s. It was in one of their offensives against the Mengistu regime, and some BBC reporter was interviewing him. And he starts talking about how Albania is the only socialist country in the world. It's kind of bizarre to see this guerrilla, you know, with a bunch of other guerrillas clearly very far away from Albania, you know, engaged in a military, in a battle, like they're interviewed on the battlefield, like they're shooting an artillery piece, you know, raising this political idea. So like there's a case when, you know, there's the leadership of these groups and stuff would definitely have political associations and ideas in surprising ways. But I think after 74, I think it's probably true that we can't assume that there was all of a sudden, you know, everybody in Ethiopia became an expert on socialism. There was a loosening of, not an elimination, but a loosening of censorship rules in the early years of the military rule. And there were commercial magazines that basically acted as mouthpieces for the EPRP and Mason. And they were full of historical articles about, you know, Russian and Chinese revolutionaries and previous struggles and stuff. I think people consumed this with a lot of excitement, but I do think that because of how quickly everything happened after 1974, that what actually happened was that they didn't have time to organize people as profoundly and as politically as exactly as you're talking about, which as smart and as educated as the leadership of EPRP was. You know, at some point they all had to go underground, and then when the terror started, you know, their names were on lists. So like the government or the socialist movement initially, they knew who their targets were. Like they were looking for the EPRP leaders who were the ones who, you know, had done all this, the theorizing and the thinking and the high politics part of it all. And so I think that one of the reasons that the repression was so successful was because once the movement had been decapitated and once its sort of elaborate organizational structure had been broken and its its mimeo machines smashed, they had a real hard time politically advocating against, you know, what was happening. They could, you know, they could, you know, they could organize to protect themselves. They could, you know, convince people in a neighborhood to help defend themselves. You know, there's a lot of, you know, regional, local, like resistance to specific acts of repression. But I think that the more successful the repression was, the political level of it all went way down. It's awkward because I feel like I've spent my entire life being a socialist or a communist with a little asterisk, with this urge to say, well, that's not actually what I mean by socialism or communism. So if you're in a situation where, you know, you're in the EPRP, you have this expansive vision of socialism and popular democracy, and you're fighting this government that claims to be socialist. Well, I think that the longer that goes on, the harder it is to say, you know, socialism is a good thing, because it's not really what we're experiencing right now. Like it just becomes hard, you know, it's like, it's a very abstract thing to hold on to. And I think that's sort of a core of why the global left is in such trouble now, because it can't quite figure out how to say, you know, socialism is still a really great thing that we should really still be fighting for. But, oh, by the way, there are a lot of really bad socialists out there, and some really horrible stuff happened. And yet you can still look at this theory and find the keys to human liberation in it. Like I think that it's a possible argument. I mean, I make that argument all the time, but it's not an easy argument. And I think that the facts on the ground of what happened in Ethiopia, you know, becomes harder and harder to resist. Well, all of us who live in, you know, North America or United States have to, like, we have to have a little voice in our head saying, oh, that's a lie. It's not really true. You know, this thing that the way they say things are, you know, we know they're lies, but we know that most people, they can't live in a world of lies. You know, like, people need to embrace reality in some sense, you know? So it's like, I mean, you know, most people are, in the United States, most people are well, I mean, I think people are evenly split between, you know, Democrats, Republicans, and non-voters in the United States. Like, I think that those are like three groups. And I don't think all that groups are filled with people who are like, well, this is what I got to do. You know, I'm not real happy about this, but this is what I got to do. And I think in a situation like Ethiopia, it's like 10 times more extreme than that. It's kind of like, well, you know, either I can have this leaflet that talks about true socialism, and if somebody discovers it, they're going to shoot me in the street, or I can, you know, make my peace.
Yeah, I suppose that what I was trying to get at is that there's something almost mystical about it, because you're completely right that in the name of socialism, there has been terror, and in the same way you could argue that there are elements of Chinese society now which are driven by communist utopianism, but it still has this authoritarian capitalist nature that you describe it as. So when things embody both of these things simultaneously, it sort of becomes quite, it's almost like the semantics of it become less important and the historical facts become more important. So my question about Marxism there, is it not a question of human struggle, and is sometimes potentially that the Marxist critique applied to Ethiopia, does it in some ways miss things, because Marxist critique was originally aimed at societies that had industrialized in certain ways? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's fair. I mean, I think that, you know, there's this notion of scientific socialism, which is often misused as a you know, a wedge to say, shut up. You know, it's like my politics are scientific, whereas yours are imaginary. So you know, my version of socialism is correct because it's a science. Well, that's bullshit. But theoretically, Marxism is based in this technology, which is, you know, provable in the real world and has a relationship to reality. And in my opinion, the kernel of which is still true. But I think, yes, absolutely. You know, it is certainly not 1848 Europe. You know, it is certainly not 1917 Russia anymore. You know, it is not even 1949 China, you know, or Saigon 1975. Like, these are all, you know, past moments. And I think well, what I personally aspire to is finding some kind of creative flexibility to apply this allegedly scientific philosophy on our real world tasks now, without accidentally throwing out, babies in bathwater. I mean, like I think, if I was I don't know what the UK equivalent is, but I mean there are many leftists in the United States who say, yeah, I'm all for updating Marxism. That's why I think it's important to vote for Democrats and the way we're take a long view and do what I mean. The largest left group in the United States is now the Democratic Socialists of America, and although there are radical people in that group, fundamentally their politics is about accommodation to the processes of capitalist America and to electoral politics and to a certain kind of bourgeois respectability. I think that's a betrayal of it's like it's using creativity in a wrong way to kind of like renounce the important stuff by saying that things have changed, they're different now, it's whatever. So I think you've identified, I think that's a really central problem, because I think it is absolutely necessary. Like we can't pretend that, all we need to do is, put on leather jackets, go stand on a street corner or the gate to a factory and say, comrades, proletarians, join us, overthrow the imperialists. Like, it's just, it's like, I mean, come on, I mean, it's just,
feel like that sometimes,
but it doesn't mean that those working people don't still have to fucking overthrow the capitalists and the imperialists. Like the issues are the same. How we learn to talk about them, to make things meaningful, or to shape the methods now. I think is a really deep question and a really key question. And absolutely, I mean, I think that it's one of the reasons that I think I was really drawn to this subject, is because leftists endlessly rehash certain historical chapters, and I think some of that's a little tired, and I think that there's a lot of other things that may not have the last word, the answer on what the Ethiopian revolution teaches us as progressive or revolutionary minded people in the Northern Hemisphere in 2020, maybe even 2021. I don't have that answer, but I think that expanding the discussion out of some of the too well tread volumes is really important. So I personally like living with this subject for the years that I was actually working on this book. I think that my politics really deepened and developed in a really significant way. I personally walked away with a lot more understanding from this chapter, I'm hoping that some of that comes across to other people through the point of this book. But the issues you're raising are really central. I mean, it's absolutely true.
Yeah. Thank you. I mean, I could talk for hours on, but yeah, thanks.
So one of the things I wanted to talk about a bit about was, so the EPRP sort of referred to the Derg as being kind of fascist. And so Ethiopia has a sort of long history of sort of imperialist domination and sort of fascist invasion. So how did this sort of shape the left's critique of the Derg, the Soviet Union, and other global forces of the period.
I think that's really interesting. I looked and I report a little bit in the book on different theories of fascism, and the Italian invasion of Ethiopia in the 30s was really brutal, and the resistance to that the resistance to that invasion is something that people still remember and talk about. I mean, if you actually go on Facebook, like there's all these Ethiopian groups which are devoted to like almost nothing but sharing pictures of resistance to Italian colonialism in the 30s. It's kind of amazing. They started using the word fascist about the military government very, very quickly, almost presciently, in a sense. Like I think that they were really clear that this was going to be a very dangerous situation from the beginning with the military, and it was more dangerous than their most vivid imagination. I found myself having a lot of trouble hammering what happened in Ethiopia into various leftist definitions of fascism, and the one that I settled on was from if you've read the book, it's an excerpt from Jay Sakai, who's actually not a leftist theory, who I really like very much. Like I'm not into his book Settlers, which is very, very influential on the American left. I don't know if that's if it's really something that people in the UK read, but in the United States, his book Settlers is very, very influential, but I think somewhat problematic. But he had a definition of fascism that I felt really resonated with the role that Mengistu was playing, that his relationship to class and the state, his sort of being somewhat apart, actually, from classes, exactly. Like he was, he's not. People leftists like to talk about fascists as the last gasp of big business trying to forestall workers' revolution, and I think it's actually more complicated than that. One of the questions that I'm really left with, having done my research and having lived in the United States for the past 3 years, what does it mean to call something fascist? And what are the implications of that? And I'm actually I'm still in the process of struggling with that, because I think that on the one level, fascism has a veneer of social radicalism to it, and of, a society willing itself to become something new. And in that regard, there's something sort of easy to grasp about it. But what does it really imply about the nature of the struggle that we need to be engaged with? And that's where I'm less clear that of what the implications of calling something fascist are. And I've actually taken to asking other leftists this very question, because does like, if you identify, say, Donald Trump as a fascist, which I'm somewhat sympathetic to, although I would not describe the United States government as a fascist state. But what does that suggest? Like, when you accept that label, what does that mean? Does that mean that you're in favor of kind of cross-class popular unity against the forces of reaction without with your goal of socialism no longer being important because you just want to defend bourgeois democracy, or is it something deeper? So I guess for me, I have to answer this question with I think the most useful thing about looking at the Derg as fascist is being honest about its social role, being honest about the class origin of in the officer corps of the Derg, being honest about its repression, being honest about its relationship to the state and its disinterest in democracy. I think that all those are very, very useful, and to that regard, I think that the word fascism has something to teach us, as the repressive horror that the Ethiopian left experienced at that moment was certainly, equivalent to anything that the Nazis inflicted on the German left. But then the complications are, and there was actually, it's not that much written on this in the literature, so I didn't go very deeply into it. I think I refer to it a little obliquely in my book. But there was this suggestion that because the Derg was fascist, that what the EPRP really should have been doing is trying to build this broad popular front with the Ethiopian bourgeoisie, such as it was, and that discussion was kind of foreshortened by the repression itself. Like they were talking about expanding their social basis. I think the EPRP was, I've talked to people who said that they really strongly cultivated like the shopkeeper class in Ethiopian cities, and they definitely were making attempts to unite certain disparate groups, but I don't think I don't know what that word, what the implications of that word are for your positive program or your goals. Like, if you believe you're living under fascism, do you then celebrate it when fascism is replaced by bourgeois democracy? Well, I guess so, sort of, but it's very complicated. So, I don't know. The inverted social radicalism of fascism is probably one of the more important things to address, and one of the things that I worry about in today's political world. Just on I don't know how much American politics you all are following, but we have this QAnon thing here. Well, one of the things about QAnon is it's got this slogan, where we go one, we go all, which is kind of like it's a call for class solidarity. It's a call for class solidarity because lizard people and Jews and cannibal pedophiles, are secretly organizing society, which is, of course, right-wing bullshit, but it nevertheless is making use of. So I'm actually pretty comfortable thinking of like QAnon as a fascist movement, because it takes people's aspirations and then incorporates a plausible, partially true social analysis with then a crazy reactionary social program. And I don't know. I guess I'd want to think a little bit more to what extent. I guess that's sort of what was going on in Ethiopia too. Not exactly, but it's they definitely made Lenin into a defender of something that Lenin was not really a defender of, so I don't know. Does that address us of what you're talking about on the fascism question?
Yeah, no, I think it does. Yeah. Yeah, so maybe I wanted to just sort of move on to the so-called Red Terror, maybe for the last two kind of questions, really. So one of the it's one of the most difficult bits of the book, really, well, emotionally difficult elements to sort of read the book. The way that the Red Terror is, first of all, used against the EPRP, and then, of course, all other leftist groups as well. So I'm sort of wondering, can we learn anything from this, or is it just this really horrific moment in history that is just a tragic defeat? I guess that's the sort of first kind of question. Is there something that we can learn from this? Is there something that we can take from this? Quite difficult.
Well, what I'm really struck by is how much the pain of that period is still an informing factor in Ethiopians' lives, and I think that the trauma of that terror. I think I think it's a big challenge to the left because, and you have to say, like, I understand your sister or your brother or your aunt was, gunned down in the street in the name of socialism, and I'm a socialist, and I don't think that that's right, and I don't think that was real socialism that they were killed for, but I think that's I tried to make friends with a number of people on Facebook, and I actually often I met Ethiopians who were willing to befriend me because I was expressing like a real interest in Ethiopian history and a sympathy for real people in difficult times. But I think when I think the more they realized, some of them realized how serious my commitment to socialism was, they found it a little less like they questioned my sympathies for their lost relatives or something a little bit more. And so I think it's a real challenge for living in the world ought to make you really angry. Like to see the injustice and the brutality that people suffer, and that is, totally like people just, close their eyes to just the worst kind of things, and people tell themselves lies to get over all sorts of stuff. Well, I think that the left is really called to be better than that, and I get very disappointed in leftists who want to play the partisanship game of everybody on my side is and has always been right, and everybody on your side is and always has been bad. And I think that's a separate question than say the class division of society. Like, I mean, you say, like, am I always for the working class against the ruling class? Absolutely. But do I think that people calling themselves socialists or communists have always been on the right side of every argument? Absolutely not. And I think some of the other stuff I was saying about the left needing to come to terms with it, with the best and worst of the 20th century that's really important. Like, I don't think you can't lie to people who have been through stuff like that. You can't, people. I mean, there's this very sweet lady on Facebook who her sister is, in 1977, during the height of the repression, the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Party's youth group decided it was going to celebrate, it was going to have a May Day like counter festival, and they were going to bring their banners to the official government May Day celebrations. And for some reason, they didn't quite understand how the tide was changing, and the government sent people out to everywhere they were preparing to get ready for this thing and kill them all. Like killed hundreds and hundreds of high school age kids, like in one night. And so this lady I met on Facebook, you know, her sister was one of those people who was killed, and she's, you know, now 1977 is like, you know, it's almost 50 years later, and you know, that's the defining chapter in her life, is her sister being, you know, a revolutionary, you know, out on the street calling for freedom and being killed by a communist government, you know, for that. Like, so that's, you know, that's the way she remembers that. So I think we have to, you know, be honest and open about that, and try and reconcile, you know, what we believe with all of that. And I don't want to gloss over that. I mean, I can, you know, get my vision of, you know, socialist liberation, what's possible for human society. I mean, it can pull on my heartstrings and make me really, like, you know, emotional over the potential of, you know, a human movement for liberation. Like, that's something I really, really want to see. And I do believe that Marxist ideology holds keys of understanding to the way the world works. But man, you know, don't tell me that, you know, you've decided that because Mengistu said he was a socialist, that actually we're socialists, and you're going to rationalize, you know, killing this sweet lady's sister. You know, like, it just doesn't happen. That's, you know, I'm not going to get there by doing that.
Yeah, the thing that you last said really, like, it really resonated with sort of, like, if we're talking about feelings, I suppose that it really resonates with the things that I'm interested in philosophy and politics, which is the Frankfurt School, because it seems like that there's a lot of just the way that was then, that Marxism was appropriated by the Frankfurt School seems to make a lot of sense here, because the reason why you're for the proletariat above the bourgeoisie is because inherently that is the people who are suffering, or that is the people who are forgotten. And it's that sort of the way in which the Frankfurt School take the utopian aspects of Marxism seems to be the bit that, like, I think is really, really sort of interesting and key for understanding modern politics here. Because, like, for example, when you're trying to understand even the idea of what fascism might be in comparison to just sort of a strong communist state that doesn't want to be undermined by any, so it's because it ignores the suffering. And I suppose that my question earlier it was also trying to get at the same thing, is in what ways did the form of communism forget certain other aspects of Ethiopian culture which we don't talk about anymore, like the tribal system seems to be dissolving, and that's a big part of people's cultural heritage. So there's suffering kind of there. I think that's a really interesting point. There's not really a question. I just sort of, it resonated with me, your last.
No, I think it's a real issue. I absolutely think there's a real issues. Yeah, I mean, I think how to evince like genuine empathy and sympathy for people's real world experiences, and trying to connect, you know, an abstract ideology with plenty of bad lessons along with the good lessons. It's definitely a challenge for people in 2020 who still believe in that kind of a politics. I'm not super sanguine about any particular attempt at revising and developing Marxist theory. I personally have more of a mind and agitation for like more agitational approaches, and what I find really interesting, one of the things about the Ethiopian situation I just found so really interesting is this not just theoretical discussion, but observations of what was happening, combined with prescriptions for what people should do. I think that's the stuff that I find super interesting, and I sort of acknowledge some inattention on my own part to certain philosophical evolutions in Marxist thought. So I think that I guess I want some balance of orthodoxy and fresh thinking, but above all, honesty. What has happened and the risks and the dangers and all of that. I'm pretty fascinated by the situation in Ethiopia today, and I haven't felt sure of myself to attempt to write anything about what's happening now, but I feel like it's although the solutions being put forward right now are very different, all the issues are all still there. All the stuff that was an issue in the late 1960s is still confronting the people of Ethiopia, and the imperialism is. I mean, I suppose in the sense that what's the phrase about high tide raises all ships or something like that. I mean, I suppose the massive development of the Ethiopian economy in the last 30 years is something that many Ethiopians experience in a positive way. Although there's also, Ethiopians who now get to experience what it's like to have, a Chinese supervisor who wants, the regimentation of labor. So, imperialism is still like a massive predator in Ethiopia, probably in a much more developed way, since it's a more developed country than it was. So the Chinese, the Saudis, Israelis, Americans, Italians, Swedes, Ethiopia is like, a bank vault with the door open. And the ethnic conflict, I don't have a platitude to offer about that. I'm even though the TPLF had this period when they were, alleged social radicals, I think that they've played a very counterproductive role in post-war Ethiopia. As for, Abiy, we know what nice liberals can really do. And so that's not, my heart really goes out to, what a strange relationship between Ethiopia and Eritrea right now. And I don't think it's, I wish you could say that that there's this newfound solidarity between Eritrean and Ethiopian peoples, but I kind of feel like it's a newfound solidarity between two gangster governments, and I'm comfortable with, the way the Eritrean regime and the Ethiopian government have been reacting to this whole TPLF situation, as much as I'm really sympathetic to people who have this grudge against the TPLF for everything it's done. It's kind of like I want to say to, if I was talking to a TPLF supporter, I'd kind of say, well, this is fine. The final chicken coming home of some 40 years of fucked up politics, with also some good intentions. I mean, the TPLF was, I found as a national liberation. I mean, let's argue with liberation. We're out for liberation. That's a good thing. But is liberation what it actually brought? I'm not really sure it did. It made the Tigrayan ruling class very powerful, but I'm not sure what it, So all that stuff is just, it's investigation, like observing the way the world is around us, and I think that's a really important first step in trying to redevelop politics based on the way the world really is. And I think that there are some analyses from Europe in the early part of the 20th century that I think are still useful for looking at the world, and there are others that I think are no longer fully adequate. And a totally non-Ethiopian example, I think, like in the United States, we have the left needs to understand who the third of the population who don't vote are. Are those, I mean, the common wisdom is those are stupid, lazy people. But maybe those are people who are too smart to waste their time with, rigged electoral bullshit. So, like, I think that the first step in the left being able to offer its time-honored solution has to be re-understanding the world and breaking out of somebody's treasured mythology. And so if you're a leftist and you want to argue that Ethiopia was a socialist paradise in the 1980s, I don't think the rest of your ideology is probably that valuable, because it shows you're not really talking about reality. And so I offer this book up as a challenge to rethink about the left, and I guess in general mythologies about recent history. It's just not just the history of 150 years ago. It's recent events too.
I'm going to shoot off now, but thank you very much for the talk. It was really good.
Well, before people start to leave, I wanted to. I don't know if everybody's read my book. I want to say that it's very cheap cover price and very cheap shipping from the publisher in France, and it's $10 American, €8, and the shipping is like, the United States is like $5, so it's quite a good deal. I'm not getting rich from it, but I want people to read it, so buy a copy for.
I do recommend it. It is really. There's a lot of stuff in there that's really quite powerful, actually, and really a really good resource, I think, as well, because knowing about a kind of left movement which beforehand I just didn't know anything really about, so it was really really recommended.
My publisher is I think it's Foreign Languages Press was the state publishing arm of the Chinese government in the 60s. That's what they published all their like cheap propaganda pump. So they sent by the millions all over the world. And I think that still exists, but these comrades in France, sort of repurposed that name to, attempt to distribute revolutionary literature once again. And I don't agree with everything that they publish, but they're making a really great effort. So I urge support of them and federal radical literature in general. So, and it's been actually really great to talk to everybody here. I'm very grateful for the opportunity.
I do have a quick question, actually. Just kind of thinking of, you were mentioning, and this is quite U.S. specific, so I apologize, but, over the summer, just thinking of like alternatives and like what the left can do to kind of get outside of especially like the Democratic Party apparatus in the United States, which I think is just a major impediment and active antagonist towards really any sort of improvement in anyone's lives. And, over the summer, there were quite a few wave of protests, and specifically here in Seattle, there was the Chaz/CHOP. And I guess I was curious what your thoughts were on that, because at least from what I saw, I went down there once, but I wasn't really, in all honesty, super heavily involved because they were beating the shit out of them, and I wasn't really interested in getting the shit beat out of me. So I was a coward once they started, attacking people. But I guess from what I could see, it kind of seemed like while that was a cool sort of alternative thing in this very organic sort of action, that it kind of got co-opted by, bad faith actors. Like there's a SoundCloud rapper who basically tried to strong arm his way into like a leadership position. And so I guess like when it was first unfolding, that was quite an inspiring sort of thing for me. But watching the way that it kind of dissipated and how they seemed to kind of, limit, like they had a really cool list of demands, but their broader sort of vision seemed to be going out of their way to not, align themselves with any sort of specific left sort of view. And so I guess I'm just kind of curious, like if that's an example, perhaps a starting point, perhaps something that could be iterated upon or something like that. What your opinion of that sort of stuff was?
Well, my opinion is that stuff like that I was really excited by all the protests this summer. I thought that they were just amazing, and I felt like I waited all my life for them, and then I was in a personal position where I really couldn't participate in them. I've been really hiding out from the pandemic, some health concerns, and very, very frustrating. I haven't been able to participate in any of that stuff. I was very involved in Occupy Wall Street almost 10 years ago now. We had a group in my neighborhood in Brooklyn that did some really great stuff, and it was a really great experience. And I think that the left that's involved in all those protests is playing with some very interesting concepts. I think this, their ideas about dual power, about holding on to institutions or territory while capitalism is still there. I guess sort of interesting ideas. I mean, I think there's some stuff there that's very interesting to see people playing with. My bottom line response, however, is I definitely find myself going back there to Lenin, who I really love, and saying, like what I think, and the Ethiopian students understood this, that they knew that they needed, the term Vanguard Party has, suffered a lot of derision over the years because, everybody assumes that means, a self-proclaimed vanguard of somebody telling them they're going to be your boss. And, in the Soviet Union, that's kind of the way it worked out. But I actually believe that there's a potential for that what struggles, like the failure of struggles in Minneapolis or in Seattle or Portland or all those places, the ultimate failure is because of a lack of focused revolutionary leadership. And I think that, without the organization and sense of goal and methods and the knowledge of past struggles, I think that an organization can build to a situation like those are kind of destined to fail. Like they're just they need what socialists have or communists have called the party, and that has so many bad connotations now. We think of some kind of like bureaucracy telling us all what to do, but the truth is we need this like fighting organization to take us to the next level. And I don't know where that party is going to come from right now, because we don't have enough organization and agreement sort of, but until that exists, like the struggles they're going to just dissipate. I mean, that's just what happens, like without that, people can do amazing things, but they have a limitation. What amazing thing can you do in one city, or one neighborhood, you're still the laws of capitalism and, and class dynamics are still there. I don't know. Every time we see, that's where really super inspiring. And the stuff like in Minneapolis, at least from here, did they actually get the city council to temporarily talk about abolishing the police? Even though it predictably is not going to happen, like the force of people in struggle engaged in direct action, it shows you what is possible, but it's not enough. It's and I think that's like the key difference between anarchists and say Leninists is, because I believe it's possible for an organization to intervene in a situation like that and still maintain, democracy and mass participation, but to focus, and to strategize and broaden the struggle and look for allies and connect to things elsewhere. Like, I really think that an organization is necessary to make all that stuff happen, because otherwise, it's the loudest person. It's, the rapper who's, whatever. That's just what's going to happen. So, I would, I think, I don't really understand the story of the various deaths that happened there. And some of them sound kind of concerning, but I don't really define the experience by that stuff either. I think that, to me, it looked like that was a pretty inspiring moment that might have ended badly. But, I think it's good to see people, attempt to seize a neighborhood during an urban uprising. That's a great thing. It's important to understand what it's not going to do for us right now. And it's not, and it's not going to turn the city council into a magic force that all of a sudden, brings socialism and racial justice to Minneapolis. But, it does as a start.
Thank you for listening. This has been the Exploding Appendix podcast. If you like this and you'd like to check out more of our work, please visit www.explodingappendix.com or follow us on Facebook, YouTube, SoundCloud, Twitter or Instagram. Exploding Appendix, ideas and culture with guts.